You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 390. And in this one, I chat with Kevin Ashworth. Kevin is the clinical director and senior clinician at the Northwest Anxiety Institute. In this episode, we discuss his therapy story, helping parents help kids and teens with OCD, helping with parental shame and guilt, psychoeducating parents on OCD, reducing accommodations, the therapeutic program SPACE, which stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions, having mum, dad, or caregiver in the therapy room, dealing with conflict between child and parent, how much should parents remind kids of therapy homework, the importance of humour, learning to be miserable on purpose, and much more. And thank you to our podcast partners NoCD. And NoCD is celebrating 3 years of partnering with this podcast. And in honour of this anniversary, NoCD have offered people in the UK a special deal because I am a UK citizen. So to honour the 3-year partnership, they are offering new members in the UK a reduced rate of $32 US dollars, or roughly about £25 sterling, per 60-minute session if you start therapy before the 31st of July. You'll be able to continue treatment at this discounted rate for 2 months. To access this reduced rate, schedule a free call with their team and mention the code OCD Stories. That's code OCD Stories to get this discount. And you can find out more by going to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD Stories. So thank you to NoCD for offering some of my listeners this great discount. And of course, if you're in the UK currently, NoCD don't take private healthcare. So hopefully this discount helps you access therapy. And of course, if you're in the States, NoCD take a lot of healthcare plans. So go to their website to find out if you're covered. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. This podcast episode is available as a video recording on our Patreon. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. So thank you to Kevin for his time and expertise. I deeply appreciate it. And of course, as always, thank you to you guys for listening. It means a lot. And without further ado, here is Kevin. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Thanks, Stu. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's good to have you here. And yeah, as you know, I love to hear people's therapy stories. And if there is a mental health one, you can share that too if you want. But just, what got you into being a therapist and in particular working with OCD?
Yeah, well, I do have my own. Unfortunately, it's not a therapy story, but it's an anxiety story. I got a degree in psychology and then ended up working with adjudicated youth in a boys' home and trying to figure out what do I want to do with this degree, and then quickly learned that I should probably pursue a master's degree. And in that program, I met a gentleman that was an OCD anxiety specialist. His name was Johan Roskvist. And he basically took me under his wing. I was fascinated by the idea of exposure therapy and just kind of in awe at how quickly the presentation of anxiety could be treated by doing something that was definitely more my style. I often say I'm not that like touchy-feely therapist kind of guy. I didn't even know that the profession of therapy existed until I was going to graduate school for it. So it wasn't something that I had any experience with. As fate would have it, going to his class one day, I got stuck in an elevator. The class was on the 5th or 6th floor of the building, and I experienced a panic attack. And I happened to have gotten stuck in that elevator with Alison Bonifay, who is now my business partner, but we had just met in this graduate program at the time, and there was another woman in the elevator. And I remember a few sensations. One is outright panic bubbling up, and as the other people in the elevator started being kind of, I could tell they were acknowledging that I was looking afraid. So they started trying to distract me, which even made me more anxious. Like it was obvious. But I had the sensation at that time that I had to go to the bathroom, and that terrified me. I thought I was going to poop. And my professor at the time, we're texting, this is in 2007 or so. And I said, the elevator's stuck. And he writes, amazing. Is anyone panicking? Like a true exposure therapist. And we got out of the elevator. They had to send somebody, and it was probably all of 10 minutes. And we got to class, and I was a wreck. I mean, just physiologically, I was a wreck. And when I left class that day, I walked up to the elevator, and all of those sensations came back. And I use that with clients now to describe classical and operant conditioning, because it's such a clear example. And when those feelings came back, I took the stairs. And then over the course of about the next 12 months, that really generalized to a lot of places. I got back to school and I got back to the elevator, but I started really obsessing about not having access to the bathroom. And I really started employing all sorts of safety behaviors. So yeah, at the time, I thought of it as this panic disorder, limited symptom panic. I even wrote a paper at the time with Allison. But it really functions very much like OCD. And obviously all the anxiety disorders are so similar, but I would do a lot of pre-checking, rumination, safety behaviors. I would want to know, I want all the certainty. I stopped driving if there was potential for traffic. So it really impacted my life in a time where I was in school trying to learn to be a therapist. And it made me feel that I couldn't do it. You know, that if I can't get over this, how possibly could I be helpful to anyone else? I also felt stuck because I had this anxiety guy that I was too afraid to tell, because I was his student and research assistant and wanting to continue this work with him, and worried that this was a sense of weakness. And so that was, for me, the first of a lot of things. I remember sitting in the first waiting room of a therapist's office and kind of wanting to lean over to everyone else in the waiting room saying, you know, I understand this stuff. I'm not like, you know, like this isn't like, it was a real leap of vulnerability for me. And it took me meeting with a couple psychologists who didn't quite know how to treat it, frankly. And I would bring in articles and I would say, you know, here's this process and we should be doing this. And one therapist just offered plenty of, you know, safety behaviors. Bring a change of clothes, you know, carry a little spray things in case you have to, you know, and I just thought, can't be it. And I remember just writing my own hierarchy as I was learning it in graduate school, and getting in traffic at 6 o'clock at night, you know, crying and gripping that steering wheel and turning up the heat and like doing everything I can. And it worked. And so that's never been gone, but it's actually been probably, you know, in addition to the education, of course, probably the most powerful thing to help me conceptually understand how to do it. And it also was the start of the clinic, as I realized there is very few people that understand how to treat this without just offering more coping skills.
Yeah. Really good point. So today we're going to talk about helping parents help children with OCD. So I thought what would be good is just to define the age range we're going to be talking about of the kids, not the parents.
Yes. Well, I think that the way that we do it too, and I think it's all children, and it's not just children. And if that's helpful, we can talk about one particular age range because it's different. But we end up working with 5-year-olds and 25-year-olds, sometimes 35-year-olds. We work with a lot of adult children that are suffering with anxiety or avoidance. And the principles are often the same to help get those kids or their 15-year-olds back into life and how to be helpful. Yeah.
Okay. But let's think about it today from, because I've done quite a lot of episodes on like the older kids, for argument's sake, living at home. Yep. So let's do kids, so maybe up to 11, and then we'll do teenagers. I know 12 is not a teen, but 12 up to 18.
Great.
Yeah, cool. So I wanted to ask a very, very broad question initially, which was just overall, a top line, how do you work with parents?
Delicately. I think the complexity of working with parents is tough, because parents are we parents are people too, and there's a lot of anxiety often in the room that parents are bringing with them. Sometimes it's their own obsessive compulsive disorder that they're working through. Um, but then it's many times it's the vulnerability or the shame and guilt of my child is suffering with something that I don't know how to solve, or I don't know how to be helpful. Or in fact, sometimes at best I've maintained this anxiety, and at worst I've probably contributed to it in some way. So when we meet parents, I think parents often go to therapy with a lot of fear and worry that their parenting is being judged. And so I think first and foremost, it's about creating that place of saying, the fact that you're here is fantastic. Let's start solving the problem, and really using a lot of empathy and understanding to help parents say, these people are not judging me. I can actually be open and hear, the things that they have to say.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, agreed. Dealing with that parental shame. Yeah, and I think it's also highlighting that when they have, lost their temper, because dealing with the compulsions can get very tiring, and snapped, and then kind of saying, well, you're human, you're gonna mess up. That's okay. It's kind of validating that.
It's sometimes teaching grace. Teaching grace. Sometimes the grace that they would have for their children and the patience they would have. You have to model that too as parents. There's no rule that part of the problem is parents want to be perfect these days. And sometimes I actually think that disallows children to even observe how negative emotion is managed. Because many parents, if they're not snapping, they're going into their bedroom and pounding their pillow or crying at night. And children have never really seen a quote unquote normal emotional response to something that's problematic.
Yeah, very, very good point. So when, from like a psychoeducation point of view, obviously you're working with a kid or teenager, and you're explaining OCD and how it works. Yeah. Do you do that with the parents? And if so, like at what stage and to what level of depth?
Yeah. It really always depends. The answer is yes. We always do it with the parents. Sometimes, depending on the age of the kid, if it's a young child, let's say under 11, we would probably do that together. And so we would probably do that after the evaluation in the second or third session, where we're describing cognitive behavioral therapy and negative reinforcement and how OCD functions. And you get to see both family members in a very non-judgy way go, that's it. We haven't even really told you all the details yet, and you understand it. We also provide the accommodation cycle that Ellie Leibowitz does a great job of highlighting. And parents are able to say, that's it. We are working so hard. And it provides this place to say, this is the model that we hypothesize of why OCD is functioning. And so we have to dismantle it. And this is where we're going to target. And we're doing that for you, young person. And we're going to do that at the same time with you, parent. And as a team, we're going to kind of conquer OCD. As a team, we're going to go after it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Can I go for it? I was going to ask you. Yeah.
For older kids, we're more likely to do that just with the team, and then have them either assign it for them to demonstrate the psychoed to their parent, excuse me, or have the parent come in and say, all right, you're up, get to that board, tell your parents what it is, and just to provide that kind of empower them to be a little bit of an expert on their own OCD and understand it. It just depends at the stage that they're willing and interested in actually conquering their own OCD.
Yeah, I like that. That's a creative way of and giving the team that ownership, right? So they really understand. Because one of the best ways to learn something is to teach it. At least that's what I found. Yeah, okay, nice. And you mentioned some stuff there about explaining negative reinforcement and the cycle of OCD and accommodation cycle. Is there anything else that's really important to get across to parents, do you think?
I think the biggest thing is the role of accommodation, but it's not just what you do and the cycle of how, accommodating emotional distress has short-term benefits and then, maintains anxiety over time. I think what we focus on a lot is the emotional response that a parent has, that if a parent is honest, when our children are in distress, parents engage in their own safety behavior to mitigate their own distress. And it looks veiled as I'm trying to help my child. But if we're honest, and parents will say, gosh, you're right. If we're honest, the thing I'm doing, the reason that I'm opening the door for my kiddo or doing a 20, 30-minute bedtime routine, or the reason that no one's allowed to wear shoes in the house, or whatever it is, yes, it's sometimes just out of convenience. Like we just have to get through our life. But many times it's, can we identify the painful point, what it feels like to see your kid distressed? And asking people to suspend that is extremely challenging. It's easy to say, don't open the door for them anymore. Don't provide this accommodation. Don't pick them up from school. But if you don't talk about how then are you going to tolerate this feeling that you're not a good parent, because that's what it feels like when your kid's in distress. How are you going to tolerate that? It's really hard for parents to follow through.
That's a really good point. And it comes back to the modeling again. Like, you need to model the anxiety of not helping your kid in this way anymore through the accommodating.
Exactly. And that's their work. And the way that I describe that is parents are really good at that with everything other than emotional distress. So what I say to parents is, when you have your child, at soccer or football practice, or gymnastics or piano or dance, and they complain of something like, oh, practice was so hard, my legs are wobbly, and parents will all like, you're getting strong, and my fingers hurt from piano. Parents they're totally comfortable with that level of distress. When a child says that they were having intrusive thoughts in math class, parents' initial reaction is, well, let's not do that class tomorrow. Let's try and create a way that you never have to experience that distress again. And not connecting that the practice on both of those, whether that's a physical sport or activity or dance recital or what have you, or practice tolerating emotional distress, they're one and the same, that you need actually more practice to get better at.
Yeah, really good point. I like that. Yeah, you're right what you said earlier about this is their work, and I've definitely said that before to them. And the kids like that when they know that, I can see my parents are fighting and struggling with their own kind of battle here as part of it. So then, yeah.
And I think that is an important piece too, because what you're offering there, in addition to just teaching the family how to do exposure therapy and remove accommodations, is you're offering perspective taking. Children inherently, and teens especially, struggle with perspective taking. And if you ask a parent, why do you think, what is your child's perception of why you're bringing them to therapy, or you're stopping doing all these things? Some kids will say, I don't know, my mom's a jerk. And if you say, is she? Or is it that she's so worried about you that she's willing to spend all these resources and time and drive across town and implement this plan? And they're able to say, yeah, that's probably true. But that's not the perception. That's not the perspective they go to, because because they're 11 or they're 15, to even worse. So you're sharing this and you're saying, so this isn't easy for any of you, and everybody's behaving like they have OCD in the home, because everyone's got rules, everyone's following rituals, and everybody is tolerating their own dysregulation when these rules aren't met, because it's terribly conflictual.
True. Yeah, it's a really good point to get across. It anxiety spills out to everyone.
Everyone.
Yeah. Even if you're really seasoned at kind of allowing that, making space for it, it's still at some point going to get you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Good. Because there's two processes here. Either your child does the work and they improve, or you stop accommodating and indirectly your child improves. But there's many families where parents stop accommodating and the children's compulsions just change. And so the parents made all the effort to, I'm no longer accommodating, but they're still watching their children have a reduced quality of life.
Yeah.
And that's got to be really hard.
Yeah, incredibly hard. And you've mentioned Ellie Leibovitz earlier. Does your center use space?
We do. We did a training. Our whole center did a training with Ellie, which and space is fantastic. So I like to say we're space informed. We've been removing accommodations from all anxiety disorders ever since we opened. Just following kind of both the intuition and what the research suggests is helpful. But I think what space did an amazing job of is putting together a really simple, well packaged protocol with a manual for families to attend to. I think we see a lot of pretty intense cases. We have an intensive outpatient program, and most of the cases that we see require a little bit more than just accommodation removal. But at the outpatient level, yes, if we have a 8 or 10 or 11-year-old come in and with OCD, sometimes we say, I don't even have to meet your kid. I need to meet you, because I often say there's very few 8-year-olds that want to spend time, chatting with a bald 40-year-old, throughout the week. So if I meet with you, you can instantly start making changes tomorrow versus 6 weeks of me building rapport with this kid.
Yeah.
You can go home and just start using supportive statements, which that's another thing that I think space just nailed, is their recipe of validation and statements of confidence are extremely effective.
Yeah, I agree with that. So, you mentioned it earlier a bit. Sometimes mum and dad are in the room, or mum or dad are in the room, or the caregiver, whoever it is. How often do you see that, and not just with the young kids, but also with the teens that actually want their parent in the room for every session to do the work with them?
I think often to start, because usually we're meeting children that are pretty anxious and just have been avoidant of a lot of things. I think depending again on depending on the function of that, is that a safety, or is that just about we're all here to learn? Because it's also really helpful that we're modeling exposures. And so we're modeling coaching. The therapist is modeling how do I be really empathic, but also very structured in saying, you got this. No, don't give up. You got this. Touch it again. Yes, you the man. Touch it again. Yes, you've got this. And that's hard to do for parents because the dynamic is just different. So that can be really helpful. And then for some, it's counterproductive. Parents fall into the role many times of speaking for their children or protecting them from what they think is psychological distress. And so sometimes, and that's not a judgment, that's just lovely parents protecting their children. Sometimes we just meet with the child to do a lot of those things and then bring parents back and go, check it out. Look what he's doing, or look what she can do. And we leave the office often. And so we're in the heart of the city here in Portland, Oregon. And we have a methadone clinic across the street, and we have lots of, we have a few strip clubs just a block away. And so any flavor of OCD, we can pretty much target. And it makes it the really fun part of the job. In our intensive outpatient program, we have a small group of about 5 teenagers and with OCD, but also panic disorder or social anxiety. And you'll see them, going down to the coffee shop together, and, the socially anxious kids ordering for everyone, and the contamination persons, touching everything, and the morality persons, waving at the strip club. And so parents watching that, I think, is really, really impactful to see how capable that their child really can be. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I ask it because it's like with my non-OCD clients, because I try and keep a 30% non-OCD. So I keep learning in other areas.
Yeah.
And even non-anxiety, just like other stuff. And they never want their parents in the room. That's like a given. It's their therapy. And I see with my OCD clients, I don't want to say 50%, maybe 30% of the time, they want one of the parents in every session. And there's times where I've been, okay, this is hindering it. The parent needs to leave, and we've kind of done that. Other times I've found it really productive because usually mum is in the room.
Yeah.
And they're, like you say, they're witnessing their kid doing these tough exposures. I can then talk with the teen in the room and the mum and say, right, what are we going to do for your homework this week? And we can say, so it's that, so they're kind of in it together. But I've often found that when the parent is talking over the kid a lot, that's when that kid doesn't want their parent in the room.
Yeah.
And then we make sure they're not in the room. But it's yeah. But I don't know, there's like an attachment thing there as well, like a dependency, and I'm not saying a bad attachment, but like a safety.
Yeah, I think and some of that is age appropriate as well. I have a 9-year-old daughter myself, and I couldn't imagine her walking in anywhere. And if there was an option, would you like your mom to leave? The answer would be no. And so, sometimes it's interesting, and sometimes OCD comes with a lot of shame. Some children have never shared that they're having harming obsessions or obsessions of being a sexual offender, and they really do not want their parents to hear that. Recently in an evaluation of a 12-year-old, just asking her in front of her dad, I do this all the time, and sometimes I forget how delicate, like, oh, OCD, it's OCD. And for her, this is the first time somebody's labeled it. And I could just see the emotion where I said, so what are some of the flavors? What are some of, and that's a strategy to try and really normalize it, but it can also it risks coming across as somewhat flippant sometimes that, and I could see that that's how that landed. Unfortunately, it was like, whoa, you're asking me this in front of my dad? What is wrong with you? I'm not. Okay. And I had him step out, and she wouldn't tell me the content, but she did tell me, I don't want my dad to think I'm weird.
Yeah. Okay.
And that was really powerful. And as we learn often from our clients, that was a moment of great kind of reflection for me to go, that was helpful. She helped me in that regard, and eventually was able to talk about her content, and eventually able to tell her parents about her content and trust that her parents can receive it in a way that is helpful. But this is a very unusual psychiatric condition, and to explain it to people that don't have it or understand it, it's confusing.
Yeah, exactly. Spot on. And then, so especially when the parents aren't in the room, how often are you updating them? Obviously with the client's permission, depending on age, but how often are you updating them? And if so, how do you update them? Is it a text? Like, this is the homework? Is it an email, a call? That sort of stuff.
Yeah, it really does depend. We have all different kinds of clients. We have clients that, we have 16-year-olds that drive themselves to therapy. Sometimes we've never met their parents. They're trucking along. Their Y boxes are going down. Those are your kind of gold. You just get a letter from parents after, 20 weeks saying, thank you. Usually there's a lot of updating. Usually if parents are bringing them, there's a check-in at the beginning or at the end. And it's not to process the hardship of the week. We kind of set those boundaries. Like, I know your kiddo has OCD. We know that they're living with OCD. So you don't have to come in and tell me Tuesday night he stayed up till 3, Wednesday morning. I think parents do that because other therapies, they've done that before, and it's hard to do therapy with kids. So parents believe that's the role that they're supposed to have.
Okay.
So I set that at the beginning. I say, you can always give me information, but I try to set boundaries that information is provided only in this 53 minutes that we're together. I don't have time to write you a summary email or even a text, frankly, after to say, here's the stuff. So sometimes that's just worksheets. But I think that is a point that we could improve on. And I think parents would agree that sometimes they feel they trust us, they respect us. But I think sometimes some feedback is, I didn't really know what my kid was doing. And because they were happy to come and they were happy to be dropped off, there was no conversation. Now, with that said, if they're younger than 12, we have really nearly shifted outside of separation anxiety and a specific phobia. Nearly our first line is just to work with parents, because we get so much more effectiveness by changing the environment at home. And then as you're a little older than 12, you're able to kind of explain, how are you going to talk about this with your mom and dad? What are you going to tell them as your homework today? And we know in therapy if they've done their homework or not, because I'm going to jump right back into that exposure next week. And if they're just as activated, I know they didn't do the homework.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey. Okay. And on exposures, how much do you get the parents involved with the home practice of exposure?
Um, Not very much. We have the
Okay.
parents get highly involved in their preventing their involvement in
Hmm.
participating in exposures, and we want the child to be uh, focused on doing their own exposure. I actually really try to avoid parents suggesting or holding kids accountable for their own
Okay.
exposures. Um, just it doesn't mean it doesn't work. It's just the dynamic ends up being one where you've got to go and do this. And I really believe that exposure therapy
Hmm.
is a frame of mind, and that I to be successful, you have to believe that I have to do this really hard thing because it's my value. It matters to me so much.
Yeah.
And when that's so, I can say to parents, I want you to no longer do the door handle, the extra plates, the special things. You're not going to do it anymore. Can you commit to that? And we have a session around that. But then I would say to the client, sometimes it's none of your parents' business what exposures I've assigned to you. That's
Hmm.
between us. And parents might, I don't see them doing anything at home. And I say that you can give me that information. That's totally fine.
Yeah.
We will track whether progress happens, but it
Don't
just
nag them.
rarely, yeah, rarely does. If someone doesn't, there's some. If someone's not going home and doing like there is motivation to get better from OCD. It's really problematic,
Hmm.
and if somebody, adults or children, are not going home and practicing, sometimes I think I haven't demonstrated it enough. I haven't shown them, and I think where we
Okay.
fall short sometimes is assigning exposures far before doing them together in session. And sessions become
Hmm.
case management because there's so much going on. Okay, get that done. I'll see you next week. Remember
Yeah.
number 3 on the hierarchy. And if we haven't, because it's so nuanced, and so I need to watch you and how you do it, and what
Yeah.
subtle safety behaviors are kind of seeping out of you while you're doing, the imaginal script or what have you. So I actually, yeah, we try and stay clear of having parents running around because kids are used to that. Prior to that, it's have you done your homework? Have you done your piano lessons? Have you done your have you? And I would actually, what we often assign is time throughout the week where you're together and you're not allowed to talk about any expectations of anything. You just get to hang out, play a game, play a board game
Hmm.
together. There are these things from the 80s that we used to do where you'd sit around at a table and you'd all actually face each other and talk, but you're
Hmm.
not allowed to check in about grades or ERP or
Yeah.
because I think the biggest complaint, and so I'm kind of belaboring the point here, the biggest
It's good.
complaint issue from teens is once we give parents the psycho ed, parents get into this. Well, it's an exposure. Well, it's an exposure. Well, you should do an exposure. And so when kids are just like, yeah, I don't really want broccoli. It's an exposure, and it's like, it's not. Stop telling my parents everything is an exposure.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And I guess, yeah, if the parents are nagging, for want of a better word,
Yeah,
the the kids are going to start to rebel and then they're getting annoyed at the parent instead of the OCD.
exactly.
And we want them focused on the OCD, being annoyed
Yeah.
at that, not at mum and dad. Um, so I guess that was going to be my next question. You kind of addressed that, I think, a bit with the once a week, play a board game, whatever it is. Just
Yeah.
don't talk about demands or things or grades
Yeah.
or whatever. Which was like, well, and I've seen this in my practice where especially teens, young teens, start rebelling against their parents, which is arguably a normal part of development. But
Yeah.
when OCD is involved and then the parents are like, he or she isn't getting any better, they're not doing the exposures at home. And how do you kind of deal with that conflict between child and parent if you've seen it come up?
Yeah. And so it often, from my perspective, it depends on the cost of OCD. If the cost of OCD is that it's somewhat of a nuisance in the home, we have lots of patience for that. And it's really about helping parents have very reasonable expectations because they do skew. There's a tendency to not know, like you don't know the version of your 13-year-old without OCD, but maybe they would never have done the things that you think OCD has prevented them to do.
Hmm.
But if the cost is massive, If they're not leaving their bedroom or they can't shower anymore, or then we will say to the teen, unfortunately, you're not doing the work. You're avoiding therapy. I want to help you. I want you to run this ship, but you're not choosing to. And that's okay. But we're not, as your team, we're not going to let you just suffer with OCD. So then we move from just accommodation removals to contingencies. And it's just a very basic, it's the basic behavioral principle of the carrot or the stick. And we try and understand the child and what's motivating to them. And it's quite effective. And so for children that are really, really stuck, like not leaving their home, there has to be a cost. And the cost has to be greater than the fear. And that's a really scary thing for parents. Exposure is scary enough, but us implementing contingencies such as, if you don't do X, you no longer have access to typically it's internet and video games, typically.
Yeah.
Or when you do this, you're going to hit the jackpot. And for some kids, that's very motivating. And for others, that's not at all. And so it just depends. And there is risk of shame, there's risk of guilt, but there's risk of that in all of it. And what the conversation we have with parents is, there's a big risk of your child not functioning for another 6 months if we don't do changes. And they will be distressed. And we explain extinction bursts and we explain their desire to maintain these patterns because it's out of fear. It's totally out of fear. But then we work hard to really create plans for the parents to implement. And we have a lot of success. Only do you get access to this when you behave this way. And so the fear is there that they're not internally driven, they're not internally motivated, and that it's not going to sustain because they're just doing the behavior for the shiny object, or they're doing it to avoid a punisher. But what we're banking on, what we're going for is, if leaving the house is terribly distressing, let's just say for fear of contamination, and I offer you this shiny carrot and you resent me for offering it to you, but you want it so bad and you leave, you have an opportunity to learn that you're okay. You have an opportunity to learn that you're capable. But more importantly, parents learn that the child is capable. Parents learn that they can do these things. And we need lots of frequency of those things for them to get back into the routines that they have. And so not every family wants to go that route. They don't want more conflict because they're signing up for, a battle at that point. And we have to have all of the things in place to make sure everybody's safe and parents are taking time off work. And, it's a big undertaking. And these are for more intense, severe cases of usually avoidance because of OCD. But yes, sometimes when kids don't choose it, we help parents help work through choosing it for them, essentially.
Yeah.
And I think that's just how fear works. I don't think we can expect somebody when you're very, very afraid and you're 12 to say, I totally get the mechanism. I have to feel worse, but I'm totally safe. I have to feel terrible, but what you're telling me is that then I will feel better. That's hard to sell. And then what most parents do, unfortunately, is most parents always just add an additional expectation. So once the child demonstrates that they can do something, which is the treatment goal, if he could just do X, once he's doing that for 2 weeks, parents are like, yeah, but he's not doing this. And we're like, well, wait a minute. When I met you, you would have been so happy with just this. And kids know that. And so they know if they just get dressed, the next thing is you need to leave the house. And if they leave the house, that's all we want for him is to leave the house. We don't care about anything. And as soon as he's doing that for 2 weeks, it's like, well, is he going to get back into school? We don't care about grades. And once the kid's in school, it's, well, just pass. And then once they're passing, it's, well, why aren't you getting A's? I mean, it just never ends for these kids.
Yeah, I see that. And then, because you do intensive outpatients, like you said, you'll see some quite severe cases. I've seen a few times where the kid or teen is worried, especially around, say, contamination. They're worried that if they start doing exposures, they're obviously going to contaminate their safe spaces. I'm doing quote marks for anyone that can't see. they contaminate their so-called safe spaces. And the worry is, well, then the things that I'm still able to do, I won't be able to do anymore because they'll get contaminated. And then you've got mum or dad saying, or caregiver saying, I don't want to push them too hard in this area because they're still doing maybe a sport. And that's the only good thing that's going for them at the minute. So there's this fear, like OCD's got the family over a barrel, and
Absolutely.
And as the therapist, I find that how hard do I push here? Because do we think, no, we need to really go for this? But there is a risk that it could push them back. But quite frankly, not doing that is keeping them stuck. So it's how do you push in that situation, or what do you do in that situation?
It's really hard. I tell families that, OCD is like a small rowing boat riddled with holes, and people love to pick the hole they want to focus on. But you've got to solve all the problems to improve. So small, subtle, if you think of not the content of OCD, if you purely think of the mechanism behind it, if I'm doing compulsions over here in one direction of my life while I'm doing exposures in another, I am still saying that I don't trust that things will be okay, whatever the content of your OCD might be. Nevertheless, that's the reality of it. And so I think that is where I want clients to have a lot of autonomy and just talking through. I don't want you to stop doing this thing that's really great. We have kids that come to us that haven't stopped school, and their OCD is so impairing that they need an intensive level of care. And by going to our intensive outpatient program, they would have to stop going to school. That doesn't make any sense. They're already so functional in a certain area, but we need just a few extra hours of ERP. So how do you make sense of that? And it's about saying, the question when you do exposures is, what is the learning? And so if I can stay away from an area that right now feels important to protect, a sport, an activity, a safe space at home, your one nook and cranny that feels clean. I'm happy to do any other exposure, because the learning hopefully is this generalizable to these other things? But if you are doing exposures for the sake of checking a box, you're missing the point anyway. And so if you're saying, well, I did my exposures this week, but I'm still keeping this thing extremely safe, what you're saying is, I'm not actually being vulnerable in this process of exposure therapy. I'm actually being, it's probably a safety behavior. I'm just really being careful. It's the equivalent of me driving, but driving only at night when there's no traffic and and so, I'm driving. That's great. But I'm not vulnerable. I'm not risking it. And what I use as an example of that too is I really like Brene Brown, and obviously she's not an exposure therapist. She's a researcher, but she talks about vulnerability, and her definition of vulnerability is risk. To be vulnerable has to have these three things: risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. Well, she should be an exposure therapist. So I ask people when they're doing exposures, does the exposure hit all these three things? Is there risk? If you have certainty that the bad thing isn't going to happen, or that the doorknob's just been cleaned, that's not an exposure. You're just touching the doorknob. If you don't know it's going to activate you or not, it's not necessarily an exposure. If you know it's not going to, it's not an exposure. And if you have no uncertainty, it's not an exposure, but it looks like an exposure. You're doing the thing. And that's the conversation I have when people don't get better, even though they're doing exposures, is you're probably internally doing a lot of things to mitigate those three things, which you're doing all the work. You're just not getting the payoff. And that's because it's so scary. It's so scary.
Yeah, I like that. That's a really good point. So I got some other questions for you different to the topic. So is there anything else you wanted to say or bring up on this topic?
I think that's it. I think the piece that I really believe is truly important is helping recognizing the challenge that parents face with their own version of what being a good parent is, And that's why parents make so many decisions. In workshops at the IOCDF, we just got back from the IOCDF, which was fantastic. And we did a teenage workshop. We took the whole team. But last year we did a parent training at the IOCDF, and we asked people are willing to share their most embarrassing, accommodations. And people share the most outlandish things, that they've done for their child's OCD. And we do that to add some humor and levity to it. But it's just recognizing that parents, you sign up to pretty much do absolutely anything for your child. And it's only an accommodation when your child is suffering with an anxiety disorder or OCD. Outside of that, it's just called parenting. Parents are happy to drive to the store at midnight to get the marker for the kid project the next day or the special glue that they need. And so they're not doing anything wrong. It's just when it's ineffective, that's going to be hard emotionally for a parent. And that's the piece I think that therapists also need to attend to if we want them to stop doing accommodations.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yeah, that's a really good point. So there's a couple of things on your website that I just wanted to highlight. So on your profile in particular. So on your website, it says that you use a lot of humor and believe that it can help change people's relationship to anxiety. So I agree with you, but I'm just curious why that's so important that you wrote it down.
If I'm honest, I probably wrote it down as a precautionary safety behavior. So if I say something sarcastic and you give me a hard time, I can say, I told you that's who I am. Now, I think anxiety requires everyone to be so serious. And I think there is something extremely accessible about having the therapy session be light. And I didn't mention this earlier, but part of sometimes my concern of having parents in the room is it might limit kind of the silly and goofiness that I might be with a kid. I think that children that are in therapy for OCD, by the time they meet an OCD person, have likely been in therapy quite a bit, most of the time. And I think such an effective intervention is doing the unpredictable. So I try not to attend sometimes to the things that that therapists attend to, because it's so predictable for them. We're going to ask the same questions and those kind of things. And I really try to help with the vulnerability by being pretty goofy in the session or in the IOP group, because I'm in that role now where they can say, who's this kind of weird old guy? But I think it allows people to say, well, if he can put himself out there like that, the stakes are lower. We still hold power as a therapist and we, a person of authority. And a lot of our clients have these perfectionistic morality type concerns as well. And they want to do therapy right. And I want to kind of help them see that that's not what this is about, that this is my opinion, but this isn't cognitive behavioral therapy for OCD. This is a perspective of navigating the world, and hardship is there. Stress is there. Uncertainty is there. Pain is, this is what living is. And I think if you make it to, a certain age, you realize that every single person has. So I think that that's important because it's a gift, whether it's for your OCD or your any other anxiety. Like being vulnerable is such a superpower. And practicing, not worrying so much or tolerating the uncertainty of what people think of you is a gift. So yeah, I think it just cuts the seriousness through and helps people feel like they're people versus patients. Yeah.
Yeah. Good point. I like that. And then I've got a quote here. It says, what it says on the website, I copied and pasted it. It says, Kevin likes to empower his clients by saying, brackets, in regards to ERP, you're already miserable. You may as well be miserable on purpose.
Yeah. And I have to be honest. I don't remember. I have to assume that I got that from somewhere. So if somebody hears this and they know exactly where that quote came from, I can't remember whether I put that together or I read it somewhere. So I can't cite it, and I certainly don't want to say it's mine. But I do say that all the time. And I fundamentally believe that exposure therapy is miserable. But that's the trick of OCD. The trick of OCD is you wouldn't be in therapy as if you did all these compulsions and then OCD said, cool, thanks, you did it. You're off the hook. Enjoy your life. people are doing all of these efforts to try and mitigate anxiety. And it's actually the efforts they're doing that are impacting their life.
Yeah.
And they're miserable. If they're showing up to therapy, there's something still not working. So for me, to sell exposure is basically saying, I'm just asking you to do the thing, but you have total control of it now. You get to own. Because anxiety, the treatment is no longer entering a room and looking around at every corner, and I'm kind of pretending like I'm, looking around under the couch. That's what living with anxiety makes you do. How can I avoid potential distress? And what I want our clients, all ages, is to be able to walk into a room and greet it and say, "Where are you? Let's go, baby. Let's go looking for this." Because it's so empowering and that's where confidence lives, is by doing hard things.
Yeah.
So be miserable on purpose, and it always gets a chuckle out of people like, I suppose that's what we're doing.
Yeah. Voluntarily suffer. Yeah, true. Okay, cool. So, was there a time in your life? Oh, no, there was actually. So what age were you when the panic happened with the elevator?
I was probably, 25, 27, probably 25. Yeah.
Okay, let's go 25. So, you pick up that phone to 25-year-old you. What did you tell him?
I would tell that 25-year-old that it's okay to be human, that you don't have to have it all put together, and take every opportunity to be vulnerable. And, that's a lifelong lesson. And, that's a hard thing to practice even today at 40 years old. But I think that's what I would tell the 25-year-old. And that's what I think exposure therapy does for you, is knowing that, being miserable on purpose has an outcome, which increases the quality of life. And I didn't know that then. And so I ran as fast as I could. And once you start running from the things that you're afraid of, that thing chasing you gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And all I had to do was pivot and turn to it and say, "What you got?" And if I could have done that immediately, I wouldn't have had 12, 18 months of that thing chasing me. And, I finished that graduate program. I went on to another graduate program, but I did it with insecurity because of that. It always feels like the sky is going to fall. Either people are going to find out. I mean, this was such a secret for so long, because it felt like such a flaw. And that's the piece that I would have championed, I think, at 25, is I would have just been able to say, I'm really anxious about that. And so I'm going to work through it, but that might mean I'm late, or this is happening, or what have you. And kind of owning that vulnerability.
Yeah. Really good point. And then billboard, you got one on the West Coast or in Portland. What do you want written on it?
I think it would have to say, "Be miserable on purpose."
Okay. Nice.
Yeah. I think we're just at a place, Stu, where people don't want to experience the stress. Not just, of course, OCD is a very different, psychological disorder than hardship and misery. But the precursor to anxiety disorders is a lack of tolerance of psychological, emotional, and physiological distress. And as long as things matter, they hurt, they're hard, they're stressful. And those are all the things that make us adaptive and confident and amazing. And I think that's the job with young people, is when they're distressed, when their legs hurt from practicing a sport too much, we celebrate. And I think we still should too, when they're, afraid of a test or nervous about a social interaction or asking somebody out. We need to help them go, "Yep, that's the feeling. Good for you. That's the feeling you should have for that experience. That's great. That means you're doing something to stretch yourself." And I think changing that frame from run from it, mitigate it, take care of yourself. Yeah.
Really good point. And as you say that, my brain always goes back to, like, not necessarily evolution, but like back, 10,000 years ago, before we were in little tribes. Maybe even we weren't tribes, we were just solo families. Like, every day would have been about facing physical and mental discomfort. Having to hunt would have been scary. Like, is the whatever animal going to attack me, or am I going to get food to eat today? There's other rival tribes that may not have been as civilized as arguably we are or are not right now.
Exactly.
Is someone coming for me, like physically having to lift lots of big weight, move stuff, build stuff? Like, life would have just been, to a point, physically and mentally suffering, but we would have been very good at it and been able to do it. And now life for most of us is quite comfortable, and we just haven't got that skill anymore, I don't believe. And I think ERP is one way of learning it again.
I couldn't agree more. And when you make, people, I think, should go to therapy when you're making more decisions based on fear than your preference. That's it, regardless of the category of anxiety that you're living with. And we all know that when we make more decisions based on fear than preference, it robs just a bit of your self-esteem. And you don't trust that you can tolerate other hard things. And so I make lots of decisions based on fear, by the way. I just really try to be aware and balance those when I say, I said no to this because I was afraid or anxious or nervous or uncomfortable or what have you. But I can't let that be a pattern. I have to balance the preference and fear. So it's not, it's like your physical health, and so it's about balance. And I think when we teach that to people, they seem to understand that that's great. This isn't about being perfectly brave all the time. This is just about, how do you know that you don't want to go to the social event because you don't want to go, not because you're worried about, scrupulosity. How do you, and then if you don't, just because you don't, then I say, don't go. But you first have to be able to distinguish that. And if you have, for the last any amount of time, made most of your decisions based on fear, then we encourage clients, you don't get to pick. We're just going to assume all your decisions are based on fear to tip the scale the opposite direction, at least for the time being.
Yeah, it's a really, really good way to look at it. All right, nice. And is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today on anything?
I don't think so. You probably tell I could talk about this for forever. I love this subject. No, I just really appreciate the chance to meet you and to have this conversation.
Yeah, no, likewise. And thanks for your expertise and time. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/theOCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.